Good evening, everyone. I am Dr. Brad Glick, Director of Clinical Research at GSI Clinical Research and Clinical Assistant Professor of Dermatology at the FIU Herbert Wertheim College of Medicine in Miami, Florida. I'm your moderator for tonight's webinar, Derm Clinical Updates, Keeping Up with COVID-19. This is brought to you this evening by HCP Live and Dermatology Times. As a reminder, the pandemic represents an ongoing and ever-changing event. As such, the leading-edge information you'll receive this evening could change in a moment's notice. The opinions and perspectives expressed this evening are those of our experts. We advise our audience to follow local, state, and national guidelines during this most unprecedented time. Many of the states are opening up right now, so obviously this is a very fluid situation. We encourage all of our viewers tonight to submit questions for our experts, as we'll designate the last portion of this evening for the discussion to answer such questions, and there'll be a chat box to your right. And as you can see here, there's some notes here, and you can look through these. It'll give you some idea about how to chat into some of those questions and answers that you may have. Joining me this evening for our webinar are three leading experts in our field of dermatology, and they're both sharing their perspectives regarding the impact of COVID-19 on our specialty. So this is the question and answer portion, as you can see, and we'll move on to the next slide. This evening, joining me will be our three national experts. Will first be starting with Dr. Joel Gelfand. Dr. Gelfand is Professor of Dermatology and Epidemiology, Vice Chair of Clinical Research, Medical Director of the Dermatology Clinical Studies Unit, as well as the Director of the Psoriasis and Phototherapy Treatment Center at the University of Pennsylvania Perelman School of Medicine in Philly. Dr. Gelfand, welcome. Thanks for being here this evening. Dr. Gelfand will be speaking to us this evening about the impact of the pandemic as it affects our patients with immune-mediated skin diseases, biologic and immunosuppressive therapies. So with that, Joel, if you'll go ahead and take over, and we'll look forward to your presentation.
Sure, Brad. Well, thank you for having me here tonight. It's a real pleasure to be able to work with you and Adam and Lauren. And I'm looking forward to hearing everyone's talks, and most important, looking forward to the questions we get from our colleagues around the country who are listening in. So, I thought I would start off with a little bit of perspective and a couple of quotes that sort of help guide me as we think about this time together. The first one's from Michael Levitt, who's a former Health and Human Services Department. And he said that everything we do before a pandemic will seem alarmist. Everything we do after a pandemic will seem inadequate. This is a dilemma we face, but should not stop us from doing what we can to prepare. We need to reach out to everyone with words that inform, but not inflame. We need to encourage everyone to prepare, but not panic. And I think for those of us as physicians, we're often leaders in our families, in our communities, certainly in our practices. And I think this is the type of equanimity we want to make sure we try to strike as we're sort of trying to cope with the changing information that's going on as we improve our knowledge of what's happening with COVID-19. The second quote is by Sir Austin Bradford Hill. He is known for his work identifying smoking as a risk factor for lung cancer, probably one of the most important epidemiological findings of the 20th century. And so he said that all scientific work is incomplete, whether it be observational or experimental. All scientific work is liable to be upset or modified by advancing knowledge that does not confer upon us the freedom to ignore knowledge we already have or to postpone the action that appears to demand at a given time. And that's what we as clinicians really have to master. This concept of uncertainty, what things we really know for certain from well-done randomized placebo-controlled trials, the things that may be more anecdotal, and how do we sort of convey that information to our patients or our staff, and how do we then make decisions in that environment. So I want to talk a little about psoriasis and SARS-CoV-2. That's the virus that causes COVID-19 illness. And psoriasis, first of all, we know is associated with a number of cardiovascular comorbidities, COPD, and diabetes, culminating in about a 5-year reduction in life expectancy. And because of these comorbidities that people with psoriasis often suffer from, these are some of the same ones that drive poor outcomes in people with COVID-19 illness. So lung disease, cardiovascular disease, diabetes are some of the things that really differentiate those who have bad outcomes from those who tend to have better outcomes. And so right off the bat, we know our patients with psoriasis are probably more prone to issues related to this disease. In this work that we did several years back, we found that infection was the second leading cause of mortality in people with moderate to severe psoriasis, second only to cardiovascular disease. And that's been shown by a number of other investigators around the world. So we don't really know why people with psoriasis seem to have higher rates of mortality from infections. We don't really know if it's a treatment effect or something related to disease or their comorbidities, but at least gives us that perspective that this is an at-risk patient population. And then finally, most of our treatments for psoriasis, even the ones that are quite specific, still are immunosuppressive. They essentially work by interrupting cytokine networks that are important for immunity in the skin, as well as in other barrier tissues like the lung and the GI tract. And as a result, because of the uncertainty we have, we just don't know for certain that the effects our therapies would have on people with COVID-19 infection. The recommendations from AAD really center on shared decision-making, recommending stopping immune suppressive treatment in people with psoriasis who have symptoms of or test positive for COVID-19. And so this is pretty much how we've been counseling our patients for the last 6 to 7 weeks or so, where basically we think of it as sort of a tiered analysis. At a high level, patients who have a fairly mild underlying indication for their systemic agent, who may have major risk factors for bad outcomes from COVID-19, maybe they're older than 65, they have lung disease or diabetes. Those are people, if they're doing really well on their biologic, they may want to consider postponing the next shot and not restarting it until they see their psoriasis recurring. But some patients will have a remission on the therapy they're on. On the other hand, a patient with very severe underlying disease who has a better prognostic profile, they may be younger or don't have major comorbidities. These are people who we feel probably safely can stay on these therapies during this time. But still, we feel on the safe side it's best to probably stop the therapies if they were to develop symptoms of infection or develop COVID-19 itself. Now, this is a nice paper.
What has been your posturing so far? Sorry. How have you been handling this?
Yeah, so it's very much a case-by-case basis. And I think this schema that came out in dermatology therapeutics by a group from UCSF, Wilson Liao is a senior author on it, sort of is a clinical guidepost for how clinicians can think about these issues. And so for me, I found that a lot of our communication goes through EMR, electronic medical record, correspondence back and forth, as well as we're doing a lot of telemedicine and counseling in that manner. And I essentially counsel my patients the same way I just sort of broke it down for our colleagues here. And I would say that probably most of my patients elect to want to stay on their therapies. A handful of patients, even younger people who are perfectly healthy and have very low risk, their disease is totally cleared, I say, you know what, I'd rather just wait for my next shot because there's a lot of uncertainty. And I think that's really the advantage of managing moderate severe psoriasis at this time in history where we have so many different treatment options for our patients, whether it be systemic biologics, oral medications, or ultraviolet phototherapy. We have a variety of ways to offer to manage the disease for our patients, and shared decision-making makes a lot of sense in that context.
Staying on biologic therapies, some of the older agents, the TNF inhibitors, and we have more targeted therapies in interleukin 17 and 23 blockers. Do you have a little bit more angst with the older biologic therapies, or you feel pretty much the same about all of them?
Yes, so there's different opinions out there, and that's exactly what they are, which is opinions, often informed by basic science models, mouse models that seem to suggest what these various cytokines do in viral defense, for example. The cytokines that we tend to be targeting in psoriasis aren't dominant players in viral immunity when it comes down to it. That being said, what we know from mouse models often doesn't apply to humans. So, for example, TNF inhibitors were first studied for sepsis, congestive heart failure, and multiple sclerosis. And we know that they make all those problems worse despite all the excellent basic science data at the time. And so you just don't know until the studies are done in humans. I think, today the data that's sort of been emerging is largely sort of reassuring. There's been no major safety signals so far. There was one report out of Italy, roughly 1,000 patients on systemic agents in their practice. and they weren't able to identify any of them who got admitted to the hospital with COVID illness. There's another paper that recently came out in the New England Journal of Medicine from colleagues of mine at NYU, Jose Scher, Andrew Neiman, and they looked at about roughly 80 patients with rheumatoid arthritis, psoriatic arthritis, or psoriasis. All of these patients were on some type of systemic immunomodulatory therapy, whether it be methotrexate or biologics, what have you. And they really didn't see a clear signal there for patients being on biologics having a worse outcome than patients who weren't on biologics. They seem to have the same natural history that you'd expect of anyone with COVID-19 illness. Now, the reality is these are small studies. You really would need, probably several hundred or maybe even a few thousand patients to really know the degree to which these therapies alter risk. There's also this sort of theoretical construct out there about COVID illness in general, which suggests that up front, immunosuppression may be a problem by making you more prone to getting infected and having progression of disease. But then in the back end, it actually may be helpful for people who have severe inflammatory reactions, ARDS, lung disease reactions to the viral illness. And that's why ruxolitinib, one of the JAK inhibitors, which most of us would feel like, oh, a JAK inhibitor seems like the least safe of all the therapies, is actually being studied in clinical trials right now in patients who have sort of a cytokine storm presentation with COVID-19 illness. And so it's just a reminder of the yin and the yang of the immune system when it comes to dealing with infections.
Don't steal Dr. Friedman's thunder, Dr. Gelfand. He'll be talking extensively about the therapies. No, I appreciate that. It's interesting. So our patients have been out of our offices generally a lot in this last month and a half. What about your patients who come into the clinic for phototherapy versus many of the patients that have the opportunity potentially for home phototherapy? And of late, many of our colleagues have been talking about home phototherapy, and I believe that you have a study of which you are the principal investigator, the LIGHT study. Can you talk about that? Because I think it's very pertinent to this current pandemic.
Yeah, so the LIGHT study is federally funded by PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. And it's a study of 1,050 patients. We're doing that at 30 sites across the country currently. As of today, we have about 230 patients enrolled. And so we were going along quite well with our enrollment. But we haven't enrolled a patient in the last 30 days. So essentially, office-based phototherapy really is shut down for most practices across the country during this time period. And now a lot of us are trying to get our phototherapy practices back up and open. Henry Lim and I have a paper that came out in JAD this week giving guidance to our colleagues about how to run phototherapy with social distancing. One of the pearls we recommend is turning off the fan in the machine so that way this reduces the risk of aerosols, for example, from patients being spread, washing down high-touch surfaces, washing goggles with alcohol solutions, they're being shared between patients, spreading appointments out, things of that nature. We think if you're screening patients over the phone to make sure they're not acutely ill or having symptoms, the risk of spreading COVID is probably quite low if one follows these recommendations. Now, home phototherapy has been available for many years in the U.S. In fact, Medicare covers home phototherapy for psoriasis. Those devices are approved by the FDA and covered by Medicare. The reason why we're doing the LIGHT study is that there's not a lot of large U.S. data about these home devices. And that's created a lot of uncertainty amongst our colleagues who often don't want to prescribe them, as well as payers who often don't want to pay for them. And in our own experience, we've already been trying to work with our patients to get them home phototherapy, and it's been very challenging. A lot of our payers say absolutely no. For people who have widespread disease, they want them to use these small devices that won't be effective or potentially won't be safe for them. So it's really a hit or miss situation where it's an individual situation from patient to patient, what their payers are willing to cover for them. We are hoping to do additional work through PCORI. We have a grant under review for them where we're hoping to study really just using home phototherapy and setting in telemedicine, where we wouldn't even see the patient in the office. We just see him online, prescribe the devices, and then see how insurance barriers play a role in impacting people's quality of life and delay of therapy and things of that nature.
Very fitting for our current times. Well, Joe, I'm going to move forward to Dr. Council, and we'll circle back to you at the end in the question and answer. So thank you for that. That was really fantastic. So thank you very much. So next we have Dr. Lauren Council. Dr. Council is an associate professor of dermatology and associate director of the Center for Dermatology and Cosmetic Surgery, Dermatologic and Cosmetic Surgery, the Division of Dermatology at the Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis. She'll be speaking to us this evening regarding the use of telemedicine, kind of where we're at right now with telemedicine and the different vehicles that we have to use such. So, Dr. Council, please take it away, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much for having me. Okay, so at the onset of the pandemic, Medicare began to reimburse video telehealth visits at the same rate as in-person visits. And this certainly helps to encourage both physicians and patients to utilize this as a means of maintaining social distancing and avoiding keeping patients who are somewhat healthy out of the office and therefore out of becoming in contact with someone who may not know that they carry the virus. There are several free platforms available to do this. Doximity is one, Zoom is one that many people use, and some of the electronic health records also have some of these platforms built in. HIPAA compliance is another feature that's being waived right now as long as physicians are making reasonable efforts to maintain patient privacy and are acting in good faith. Some copays are also waived if it's thought that the payment of a copay would prohibit a patient from seeing their physician. Those can sometimes be waived, and this is true for Medicare. And a lot of the licensing requirements are also being waived. So historically, both the patient and the physician would either have to be in the same state, or the physician would also have to have a license in the other state where the patient is located, and some of those are being loosened a little bit right now. There are three main types of telehealth visits: virtual visits or two-way audio-video platforms. And those are the ones that are being used by most of the physicians in the United States. And these are the ones that are billed exactly the same way as office visits, using codes 99201 and 99215. There's also store and forward, and many dermatologists are using these. And this is where a patient might take a photograph of a suspicious lesion and then email it to the physician, who will then review it and then contact the patient with a treatment plan. And these use codes G2010. And finally, there's check-ins, which are two-way phone communications to determine the need for an in-person visit. That uses the same billing code G2012. Policies vary depending on private payers, but again, Medicare is reimbursing now at higher rates. And there are some unique codes for telephone or email only visits as well. There are a few things that are important.
What are you using in your practice right now?
Our division is using mainly Doximity and Zoom to do the two-way video telehealth medicines. We're also just using we use Epic as our electronic health record, and we're also having patients use the MyChart feature of Epic to send in photographs and then be contacted by the phone. That works a little bit better for some of our elderly patients who can sometimes have a family member take a picture and send it in, but it might be a little bit harder to convince an 85-year-old to download a certain app and do all the requirements to do a video telehealth visit.
Sure. Great.
And there are a few important things that you have to keep in mind as far as documentation of a telemedicine visit in order for it to be billed correctly. The first is the consent to treat and bill. So the patients have to be aware that you are billing their insurance, and they actually might have a copayment. They have to understand that it could actually be the same as if they were seeing you in person. You have to document who's present for the telehealth visit. If it's a minor, you have to document were the parents there, was it just the patient, who exactly was present, the location of both the patient and the physician. Again, it matters whether they're in the same state or not, and whether you were using a HIPAA compliant platform, or whether the patient was comfortable signing a waiver of HIPAA compliance. I certainly would encourage anyone who's thinking of venturing into the realm of telemedicine to look at the AAD's telemedicine toolkit. It's available on the AAD website. They have a lot of information about coding platforms that can be used in different ways to optimize the telehealth visit. CMS also has a lot of information as far as billing during the pandemic of Medicare patients. And Dialogues in Dermatology, the audio podcast of the American Academy of Dermatology, has done a series of interviews about this topic as well. And then something that I'm a little bit more familiar with, just because my practice is limited to Mohs micrographic surgery and aesthetic care, are how the pandemic is affecting the practice of these aspects of dermatology. It really depends on where you're located. There are states that have totally outlawed quote unquote elective procedures, and they have very strict definitions of what elective can be. Some states say if it will result in permanent damage or if it's life-threatening and can result in death within 8 weeks, then that surgery is emergent and those procedures are allowed. Some define elective to include some of the things that we do, but we may not consider totally elective, such as some of the skin cancer removals. So you really have to pay attention to your local regional guidelines first. Some of us are parts of larger academic or hospital centers, which also have a lot of layers of regulation and kind of define what our practice can entail at this specific moment. Many practices are having to make difficult decisions and prioritize based on tumor type and likelihood of metastasis and progression within the 8-week defined period. So while most centers are still taking care of melanomas and squamous cell carcinomas, some patients are being asked to wait longer if they have a basal cell carcinoma, to wait several weeks until things may be safer. And in certain cities like New York City, when things were really overwhelming the healthcare system, many practices completely shut down for a couple of weeks to accommodate for that. For the practices that have remained open and for these urgent cases in dermatology, it's really important that we all maintain good social distancing practices in the office. There are different ways of doing this. You can have patients call when they arrive to the office and then come up right when they can be roomed, as opposed to utilizing the waiting room. You can utilize the waiting room, but only have a few chairs out so that everyone in there would be 6 feet apart. Certainly reducing the overall volume of the office can help, both fewer patients and fewer staff. And if you're seeing fewer patients, you need fewer staff as well. Everyone wears a mask. Visitors are minimized. Really just the patients are coming in, not having their spouse or significant other coming in. Good hand washing techniques, personal protective equipment. So we're always making sure that if we're doing a procedure, we use goggles. We actually are using N95 masks for procedures on the face, although our infectious disease colleagues have told us that's probably a little bit overkill. If you think that you could get any blood or fluid on your body, you should also be wearing a gown, hat, shoe covers, those sort of things. And then we're really being aggressive about screening patients before they come into the visit. So asking questions about exposures to other individuals who have had the virus, fevers, coughs, loss of taste and smell, and those sort of things. Right when a patient arrives, we're checking their temperatures, just trying to make sure that it's safe for them to be in the office. We put them right in a room. They stay there until the procedure's done, and then they are escorted out at the end of the day. And that's kind of a big change from how we normally do Mohs surgery, where there's a lot of turnover room to room, and we take care of a lot of patients. So we're significantly down in volumes to be able to maintain this good social distancing.
Oh, Lauren, that was one of my questions. So in this last month and a half, 2 months, you've not been down completely in your department. You've been doing surgery on some of these more significant tumors, those in areas of great risk of metastasis, for instance.
Well, it's changed, and every week is something different. Initially, we really cut back and said, okay, if someone has an invasive melanoma or squamous cell carcinoma who we think is higher risk, we can take care of those patients. And that would be perineural invasion or a large tumor or an aggressive histological subtype. Once those patients had been cared for, we then kind of expanded a little bit. I'm in the middle of the country. Things have been pretty stable here, and our healthcare system has not been overwhelmed. So we've been able to take care of squamous cell carcinoma as well. But just to give you an example, we used to do surgeries 5 days a week. In the height of the pandemic here, we cut back to 1 day a week, and it was very, very few patients, only those who we really felt needed to come in. Now that things have sort of plateaued and things are doing okay, we've taken care of the melanoma and squamous cell carcinoma. We do have a plan in place in the next few coming weeks to take care of some of those patients with symptomatic or more aggressive basal cells, but it's at a greatly reduced volume. And again, we're still going to prioritize the patients with the more aggressive tumors first.
So Missouri has not yet gone to even non-essential. Today in Florida, we actually had a little bit of a change so that we can proceed with elective surgeries, but you're still to essential dermatology and those very important cancers. Is that what's happening in Missouri?
Well, it really depends on private practice, it's sort of loosely defined. So private practice has a little bit less regulations than some of the academic centers, and some of the academic centers are defining it differently. So beginning on Monday, May 4th, we are going to have some allowance of elective procedures to resume. And these are some of the things that had been postponed 8 weeks at the beginning of the pandemic. And what we call elective really are still essential. Like you mentioned, some of these are cancer operations and things like that. But starting next week, we're going to begin to do some of those again.
Yeah, it sounds like you have a backlog, and we definitely have a backlog in my clinics, and I know that we do throughout South Florida. Listen, thank you so much for that. We'll circle back to you during the question and answer. Going to move on to our next session with Dr. Adam Friedman. Dr. Adam Friedman is professor and interim chair of dermatology and running the residency program. He's also director of translational research and director of supportive oncodermatology in the Oncodermatology Clinic in the Department of Dermatology at the George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences in Washington, D.C. Adam, thank you so much for being here. As I'm stumbling through your multitude of titles, thank you so much for your expertise. Yeah, not exactly, but thank you so much for being here, and we appreciate you talking to us this evening about what we should know about the therapies, of which there are innumerable therapies that are being studied right now for COVID-19.
Yeah, no, you said it, and thank you, Brad, for first, inviting me, but assembling this motley crew of experts. Also want to give you a huge thanks for giving me such a complex and fluid topic. Full disclosure, I am by no means an expert in the treatments for COVID-19, but I guess the good news to that point is that no one is, because this is constantly changing. And so I guess in the land of the blind, the one-eye man is king, and I guess I have a part of an eye formed. So my purpose tonight is not to teach you how to use the various therapies that are being investigated, but just so you can keep in the know. Our patients are constantly sending us in questions. You heard from Dr. Council the many ways our patients can still get in touch with us. And one of the nice things is we can actually bill for those back and forth, so long as you obviously get permission from the patient, consent that this is going to be a billable service. But patients are using every way possible to get in touch with us. And part of that's going to be asking us about the therapies that are constantly spoken about in the literature and, of course, the media. So there are three general approaches. Granted, some of these therapies kind of overlap with one another. But there's antivirals, which we'll start with, immunotherapies, and this kind of goes into what Joel was alluding to with respect to a possible protective effect for immunomodulating or immunosuppressing therapies. And then I'll briefly touch on vaccines or vaccine-like approaches. The NIH just recently came out with evidence-based treatment guidelines that are available at this website. Spoiler alert, there aren't any really, as every guideline says there's not enough evidence to support anything. I think the benefit of this website and this compilation is there are some recommendations against in terms of certain combinations of therapies, which we'll talk about, that they say should not be used because of potential risk, and that risk is not outweighed by any known benefit. So I think we can all agree uniformly that this is not the right way to treat COVID-19. And sadly, there are actually some reports from poison control of people ingesting various anti-sanitizers. So I hope that across the board we agree this is not the way to do it, and that we can offer proper advice to our patients not to utilize this approach. All right, so let's get into antivirals. So when I made this presentation, and granted, I had to update it yesterday because once again, there are constant updates to the armament. There were 14 antivirals in development. I'd argue there are probably more now. And I'm only going to really focus on two. One that's had some supportive evidence and is apparently becoming the standard of care, and one that has been kind of pushed to the side. So unless you've been hiding under a rock, Remdesivir has been getting a lot of attention, especially in the last couple days. This is a broad-spectrum antiviral agent. It's been around actually for quite some time. It was actually developed initially, I believe, for SARS and various other viral respiratory infections, but it received a lot of attention with its use for COVID-19 infection. Most of the data available is non-peer reviewed, and that makes sense. We're trying to get this information out there as quickly as humanly humanly possible. So a lot of the studies that are emerging really don't have the rigor of peer review. But I think the majority of the evidence is certainly supportive, but it does go back and forth. Depending on the day, you may see a press release saying that several studies from China, multi-center study from China showed mixed results versus a study in the U.S. showing positive results. I think one of the problems is it all depends on your inclusion criteria. It always goes down to who are you studying, and depending on how severe the patient is when you actually get to them, that certainly can play a big role in those outcomes. But I include some of the studies that have been published, all of them in very high-level journals, New England Journal of Medicine, The Lancet. But as I mentioned, many of these are not peer-reviewed. Now, just yesterday, there was some breaking news. There was a published results from a U.S. study, actually right on the coattails of a Chinese study that showed there were mixed results, but the U.S. study actually was very promising. And what it showed was that 5-day treatment was analogous to 10-day treatment with respect to overall efficacy. And I'll show you that in a moment. This is funny because, once again, that kind of back and forth, even earlier, just last week, there was some negative press that the WHO released some negative results. So, it's very possible I may say all these wonderful things that, Tony Fauci gets on stage and says, this is now the standard of care, and tomorrow it could not be the standard of care. But as of right now, that is certainly where we're headed. This is one of the examples where the NIH consortium feels very strongly that we are not going to use this. So this is a combo protease inhibitor for HIV. The data available, the clinical trial data available, was really not supportive, did not show any real benefit. So I think for the time being, we're really going to be looking at Remdesivir and the data and utilizing it in the hospital setting. And once again, it sounds like the 5-day dosing has the same outcomes as the 10-day dosing, and they were looking at death as an endpoint as well as discharge from the hospital, which there's a high percentage of those who received the medication. All right, let's get on to immunotherapies. I think this is probably where we are going to have the strongest impact. And as dermatologists, we can have a lot of input here because manipulation of the immune system is our bread and butter. And the reason why I think, and once again, Joel kind of started to hit upon this, the reason why this viral infection is so impactful and is killing people left and right is not the infection itself and what it's doing. It's rather the immune response, as well as how the virus uncouples the very close relationship between two key important proteins, ACE and ACE2, which, in addition to being part of the renin-angiotensin system, are integrally involved in immunoregulation. And so when you think about that psoriasis patient who already has a predilection for inappropriate inflammation, what we can almost lean towards an autoinflammatory state, I certainly worry that this virus can push them even over the top into this rapidly, evolving and progressive cytokine storm, which is what's actually killing people. So there are a couple of drugs under investigation, most of which already have approval for other indications. The first is tocilizumab. This is a monoclonal antibody against IL-6 receptor, and it actually is approved for a very similar clinical picture, which is seen when patients are treated with CAR T cell therapy, creating CRS, which is pretty much the cancer drug version of cytokine storm associated with COVID-19. Now, this drug is approved for many different indications, which is nice because we already have some experience with it, especially rheumatology has experience with this drug. So we already have a decent amount of safety information. There is some positive data out there, but once again, non-peer-reviewed, more experience. But I imagine that we're going to see some emerging data using this monoclonal antibody. There's a sister monoclonal antibody to the same receptor. This one only has the RA indication. The one interesting bit of information that I will share, and this was not for COVID-19, but there was a head-to-head study comparing saralimumab to the other IL-6 receptor inhibitor, and the data was equivalent. So they seemed to work the same, had the same efficacy, same safety profile for RA. So maybe there could be an opportunity to get access to either one for the study and possibly management of cytokine storm associated with COVID-19.
Adam, are these,
Anakinra.
Adam, are these agents, the interleukin-6 agents, are they mainly being used in the patients that are vented, that are severely ill?
Yes, as of right now, correct. So these are patients who are circling the drain. In an ideal world, we would block that, that circling, that, that whirlpool-like, degradation before it gets to the endpoint. So that's where I think we have to be very careful how we evaluate the data. If someone is already in DIC, I don't think giving them one of these therapies is going to be that helpful. They're already throwing clots and bleeding out everywhere. So I think certainly identifying these patients early, and no question, there's emerging evidence that the skin could be a potential way to identify patients with infection, though we're not there yet. Certainly engaging these patients early to both mitigate and even possibly prevent this downstream cytokine storm is going to be the utmost importance. But yeah, as of right now, it's being studied in more advanced patients. So Anakinra, we should all be familiar with, is IL-1 receptor antagonist, used for various autoinflammatory diseases, cryopyrin, complement cascade pathway, inherited diseases. It is used also off-label for severe CAR T cell mediated CRS. Which, similar to the first biologic I mentioned, is actually a proven indication. So, there isn't really any data. They're exploring it, but just something to think about off-label. And of course, as Brad alluded to, if you're really in a crisis, certainly something you can think about. JAK inhibitors were mentioned earlier. So I'm just bringing up one that was a small study or information published in The Lancet really trying to support the utilization of JAK inhibitors. There is even some evidence that possibly through JAK inhibition, you can inhibit how the virus actually enters cells. So it's not just kind of really muting the immune response, but actually could prevent invasion as well. But granted, a lot of this is more in vitro and theoretical at this point. But as you heard, there are ongoing studies to try and better elucidate the potential role for oral JAK inhibitors. I think it's important to talk about antimalarials because I think that got the most coverage and press, and there's been a lot of confusion and also I think some unfortunate impact, especially on dermatology. I gotta say, full disclosure, and there's no confidence, just I love antimalarials. I love hydroxychloroquine. We could use it for so many things, and it works really, really well, and it's pretty safe in the scheme of things. It's been around for a long time, which gives us a lot of credibility when we're talking about that safety profile. In terms of MOA, it does a lot, and there's probably a lot more we don't understand, but it has a lot of anti-inflammatory properties, and that's probably where it could, if it will ever make its mark for COVID-19, it will make its mark. Though I will tell you there is some in vitro data that chloroquine has some antiviral properties, but I think truthfully, if it's going to do anything, it's going to be through its mitigation of the inflammatory cascade. Beyond there, we use it for a lot of things. I mean, I love it for more photosensitive diseases, even beyond lupus. I use it for photoinduced urticaria, solar urticaria, probably almost every connective tissue disease, though no question with dermatomyositis, there could be a paradoxical worsening, but I still will use it in that setting. So lots of potential there. I love this title of this paper, Why All SLE Patients Should Be Given Hydroxychloroquine, and I agree with this. Now, why I am harping on this is because our SLE patients and even our CLE patients, they are suffering not only because of shortages, but because pharmacists are being told to only dispense small amounts of hydroxychloroquine. I had to very nicely, in my super adult voice just the other day, talk to a pharmacist who was refusing to give my DLE patient, and severe DLE patient at that, more than 20 pills just once a day of hydroxychloroquine with no refills. And I had to explain what disease state we were treating, why this is first-line therapy. I was able to overturn that decision. But I imagine many of you tuning in are facing that issue as well. As I mentioned, we use it for a lot of things, and this is not even the complete list, but certainly a lot of utility for chronic inflammatory diseases. So going to COVID-19, the reality is, to date, there is not enough evidence to support its use. Even more importantly, what was initially suggested was the combo of azithromycin as well as hydroxychloroquine or chloroquine. That combination can actually increase QT prolongation, and so could cause very deadly arrhythmias. So the NIH, or the NIH guidelines I mentioned, they were suggesting not utilizing that. And actually, for hydroxychloroquine, we should only be using in the setting of the clinical trials. I actually remember seeing an email from one of the New York hospitals where they were, part of their protocol was to put every single patient who was COVID positive on hydroxychloroquine. That has since changed because of the data that has emerged that has really not been that supportive of its use for treatment. Nitric oxide. This is an incredible, very simple biomolecule. We're all making it right now for all these different purposes and more. The limitation of utilizing nitric oxide in the clinical space is that it's very labile, very short-lived, and its delivery and generation is very difficult. There is an FDA-approved gaseous tank that is available for the treatment of pulmonary hypertension, and we'll talk a little about that in a moment. So nitric oxide is produced in our body by 3 different enzymes. However, while they all have the same name, they are expressed in different locations. For example, NOS1 is expressed in the central nervous system or peripheral nerves, whereas NOS3, or endothelial nitric oxide synthase, is expressed in the endothelium. And NOS2, which is usually the cause of problems when it comes to nitric oxide, is expressed on immune cells. And this is the sucker that churns out tons of nitric oxide to literally kill everything. So why do you need to know about this? So I think there's tremendous potential given the multifaceted biological activity of nitric oxide. It is broad spectrum antimicrobial. Our macrophages make nitric oxide to kill literally everything. It does it through direct cidal effects, but also nitric oxide intermediates like peroxynitrite are also antimicrobial. As I mentioned, the endothelial cells can actually make nitric oxide. And it's actually really, really important that those cells are not disturbed and that they are able to make that very low level nitric oxide to maintain vascular stability. Now, when that endothelium is damaged, like, I don't know, when COVID-19 enters those cells through ACE2 and damages ACE2, that's when you start to get vascular dysfunction. That's where you get leaky vessels. That's where you get perivascular inflammation, and probably one of the reasons why we're seeing what are now called COVID toes, this perniosis-like appearance. So the nitric oxide is central to maintaining that vascular tone, as well as nitric oxide is important in maintaining a balanced immune system. When it goes in overdrive, that's when we see ARDS or ARDS. So I think there's a lot of potential here. I mentioned a moment ago that really it's involved in every process here. And so if you think about the kind of downward spiral or cascade that's happening with COVID infection, and granted, this is somewhat rudimentary, nitric oxide could possibly block every single element of this. The limitation is how are we going to deliver it in a meaningful way? We do have some data with respect to the use of the INO. This is the gaseous tank of nitric oxide. You may have seen in the media, there are several major academic institutions that are studying inhalable nitric oxide. The protocols are pretty robust and it's pretty expensive, but thus far the data has been very promising. I think what it comes down to, though, is coming up with a more feasible way to deliver nitric oxide over time. Full disclosure, this is something I'm working on, so stay tuned for that. Moving on to vaccines, I'm not going to spend really much time on that. Just to mention, there are many vaccines in development. Most are exploratory, but there are several in phase 1 studies looking at toxicity. But overall, I'm not sure how much this is going to do. I think there's a lot of promise here, but we really don't even know the full behavior of this virus and how it behaves. How even having antibodies, does that confer protection? Can this reactivate like hepatitis? I think only time will certainly tell. As I mentioned, there's one that has entered human testing as of March 16th. There is a list that's constantly updated, provided by the WHO, so I recommend checking that out if this is something you're interested in. Last but not least, convalescent plasma. So pretty much the idea here is simple. You're donating intravenous immunoglobulins from patients who have gone through it to patients who are currently experiencing it. Some supportive data published in JAMA, but still in its infancy with respect to understanding its efficacy. So I know that was a mind-melting, face-blasting overview of what's going on in the space. I guarantee you it's going to change, and probably a lot of stuff I even mentioned today is going to be outdated by tomorrow. So I implore you all to keep in touch with, have your finger on the pulse of what's going on. Utilize those links because they are constantly updated in terms of what's the greatest and latest. Thanks for your attention.
Adam, great job. And it seems like you really have become an expert in these therapies.
It's your fault.
Well, we really appreciate it. And we're going to move into some questions and answers, and we have a bunch coming through here. Start off first. Well, I'm going to actually throw this one out first, right to you, Dr. Friedman. We were asked if there's any studies being done in using hydroxychloroquine for prophylaxis. And somehow I think there may be one.
Yeah, I think there is an NIH study looking at that. You're right. So it goes back to the question is, when do you intervene? Like, when are we waiting till someone is on death's door? And the answer is no. We obviously want to prevent someone from getting there. Obviously, that's where our attention is. We're trying to save lives, but we really need to better understand how do we limit that progression? The reality is this is going to spread through everybody. So really what we need are preventive strategies or mitigation strategies. And so that preventative approach is going to be very important. I don't believe there's any data yet related to the preventive study, but it is being studied. I agree. I have seen that in the media.
So the next question that we've gotten here is also for you, Dr. Friedman. You're on a roll. What about ivermectin? There's been some discussion about the use of ivermectin in the setting of COVID-19, and I think it's pertinent because this is a drug that we use in dermatology with some frequency.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I saw that as well. I don't know too much about that data. I mean, just like everything, it's limited. We know ivermectin has anti-inflammatory properties. In terms of antiviral, I probably don't think that's its mechanism, but why are we currently using it for chronic inflammatory disease like rosacea? It's not just about its antiparasitic activity. It certainly has anti-inflammatory properties. But I think the data is limited, but yeah, I too have seen that. And, I think we got to think about the low-hanging fruit. So drugs that we feel comfortable with, that could have an impact, that have a pretty good safety profile. I think that's why hydroxychloroquine really took off. It's a drug that so many different specialties feel comfortable with. It's overall safe. Though I will say the recommended dosing initially, which was 600 a day, is well over the recommended dosing unless you are morbidly obese. So I think that is of concern. But yeah, I mean, drugs like ivermectin, or even, no one's even looked at the tetracycline antibiotics. We know those are anti-inflammatory as well. Like, could they potentially play a role? So yeah, I'm not surprised that ivermectin, but I unfortunately don't know a whole lot about its overall longstanding potential.
Appreciate that. Got next question actually is for Dr. Council. How are you managing your prescriptions during the pandemic? And I guess maybe this kind of relates also to using your telemedicine approach as well, too. So how are you handling prescriptions during the pandemic?
Right. So prescription refill requests usually come in either by phone or by email, or the patients use MyChart, and we're just handling those electronically. Are you talking about maybe products that would be dispensed from an office? I think it's open. It certainly could be that. I think it's really more of a general question. Maybe some people are facing some challenges, through telemedicine. You're in the telemedicine device, and then you have to maybe switch back to your EMR and then e-scribe your prescription, because I don't know if you can e-scribe from these vehicles that we're using. For instance, I use Doxy.me. Can't prescribe from that. So again, my practice is really limited to skin cancer removal and cosmetic patients, so I don't require a lot of prescriptions other than if a patient comes in for surgery, we give them their prescriptions that date. But anyone who needs one after the fact, certainly it's easy to do a store and forward. You can just do it directly through your EHR. As far as through the video platforms, I would assume that once you're done with the encounter, then you can electronically send the prescriptions.
Dr. Council, there's also another question for you about telemedicine, and are there any particular limitations across state lines during the pandemic?
So Medicare has definitely loosened those requirements. And initially, I had heard that you were not necessarily obligated to be licensed in other states where you were seeing the patients, but then there's some suggestion that maybe you have to be applying for a license in that state, so you have to be showing that you were trying to. So it really depends on where you are and which insurance carrier you're talking about. But a lot of the restrictions have been loosened just during the pandemic, and then they are going to go back to normal afterwards.
Thanks so much. The next question is for Dr. Gelfand, and we're being asked, is there any evidence that psoriasis patients and have there been psoriasis patients, I guess, that have developed the cytokine storm, and should their TNF inhibitors be continued accordingly through that cytokine storm?
Yes, this is a great question, and the answer is we don't know the answer yet. There hasn't really been much reports of people with psoriasis in these COVID descriptive studies that have come out so far. You know, it's interesting, in the world of tuberculosis, one of the schools of thought is actually that people who develop active TB on TNF inhibitors should continue their TNF inhibitors, but once they're put on antibiotics for their TB, it doesn't matter they're on anti-inflammatories, and actually the anti-inflammatory effects could be helpful for preventing tissue damage from TB. We just don't know the answer in the case of COVID-19, and at this point in time, the conservative thing to do is at the point of diagnosis or the point of someone has symptoms to stop their systemic immunomodulatory therapy. I will notice also, like, you know, there's a case report that came out in the JAD. There's been a lot of questions on the screen here about dermatologic findings in COVID-19. People have heard a lot about COVID toes, this sort of microangiopathy in ankle area, in this case the toes. And one of the reports that came out in the JAD, the patient actually was on secukinumab and had psoriasis, and their last shot was about 4 weeks earlier. And so it tells us, you know, how much we don't know what's going on. Here's an example of a person who was on immunomodulatory therapy, and that would be not consistent with the hypothesis that being on these treatments would protect you from an immunological complication from COVID-19, just an N1, of course.
We're getting asked questions, and I think it's a segue from what you just said. You know, we're learning a lot about these potential cutaneous manifestations that appear to be indicative of COVID-19, morbilliform eruptions, dengue fever-like cutaneous changes, slap cheeks like we see in human parvovirus B19. I guess we're asking if any of that, we're being asked if any of them have kind of been found to yet be pathognomonic. And I think even for right now, we just don't know. And I think our antennas are up right now, and I think we can screen accordingly. And we're being asked, should these patients be tested? Adam, I hear you trying to chime in. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think, you know, so I guess the question is, are any skin findings that are analogous to the close connection between anosmia and COVID-19, which, you know, even the CDC has come out saying that that is a clear connection? The answer is no. I guess the one thing I would argue, if as we head into warmer months and a patient who's otherwise asymptomatic develops perniosis-like lesions on, whether it be, you know, we're talking about COVID toes, but guess what? It could be COVID fingers, it could be COVID ears, you know, any distal site, you can get that, you know, vascular congestion and perivascular inflammation and some necrosis. So I think if you have someone who's never had a history, because, you know, typically it's a chronic disease, it's a warm period, that may raise a red flag. That's about as far as I'm willing to go. You know, the reality is any viral infection can cause a morbilliform eruption. Any viral infection causes urticaria. You know, that's a common cause of acute urticaria. But I think it's fair to have your antenna up and think like, why would someone be getting perniosis or chilblains in the middle of summer and they're not sitting in an air-conditioned room? I think that, to me, would raise some concern, and I probably would send that patient to be tested. But that's going to be a very small population. And I'll also argue that that finding is still pretty rare, even though it's gained the attention like a presidential candidate. It's still pretty infrequent. Like out of the several hundred patients that have come through, or actually more than that, our screening tent, and those who are positive, I've seen 2 cases of what are called COVID toes. And actually one, the patient was wearing sandals, so it made it a little difficult because it was cold and rainy. So I don't think we're there yet, but I would argue we probably will find something that's not truly pathognomonic, but on the fence, at least, to help guide our decision-making.
You know, I think it's a really interesting point, though, Adam, because, you know, a lot of our patients come in with nonspecific findings. You know, they have urticaria, an acute urticaria, or morbilliform eruption, like, could be viral, but traditionally we never test someone in that setting. I think in the era of COVID-19, especially if you have a high prevalence in your community, it probably makes sense to think about testing those patients, because that could be an index case or a person you want to prevent from spreading the virus.
I've already gotten phone calls this way from patients, and because we're doing so much telemedicine, we have a lot of patients kind of freaking out a little bit about, now I've got this rash all over my body, is it related to COVID? So, you know, we have to kind of sort through that. It's these findings that have been being reported are fascinating. You know, the petechiae, these libido patterns that have come, particularly after some, you know, initial photo exposure, and then, you know, back in the house, and then it tends to come out. I find it incredibly fascinating. To the entire group, we're being asked, and I guess you all can see the questions as well too coming through. What about spironolactone right now? Someone want to give us an update on that and kind of where we stand? Are you still prescribing it? There's, I think Emma Marmar in New York City had put out initially her concerns about continuing and wanted to discontinue it. And there's been some information recently supporting continuing it. Joel?
Yeah.
Well, I think the Academy's guidelines have come out and said it's okay to continue it. Certainly, the cardiology guidelines around other antihypertensives, ACE inhibitors, have basically been very neutral, so it's okay to stay on it. I think if the patient has a reasonable indication for it, I think it's probably fine to stay on it. I wouldn't be too concerned about it.
Yeah. I would even go as far to argue it may be protective. And the reason for that is all about how the virus enters our cells once again. So there is a serum protease that primes ACE2 to enable entry and binding of the viral spikes. On the gene for the serum protease, there is a promoter region to which DHT binds. So obviously I have no data. There's some supportive data. There was a study, I believe, out of Italy showing that there was a higher risk for more severe disease and just disease in general in patients with pattern alopecia, androgenic alopecia. But I think that at least from the mechanism and what we understand, I think there is evidence that spironolactone could actually protect viral invasion through that mechanism. I'm not going to guarantee that, but certainly we should not be stopping it in the slightest. The study that was cited that promoted a lot of this negative information related to spironolactone was from a small congestive heart failure study where they looked at ACE2 expression on macrophages. They were not looking at respiratory epithelium, mesangial cells, cardiac tissue, vascular tissue. In fact, there have been subsequent studies in animals showing that spironolactone reduces ACE2 in mesangial cells. And we know that there are renal issues in these patients. So it's all about where is this happening? It's about understanding the study. I think that study was grossly misinterpreted, and there's actually been a lot more supportive evidence that spironolactone is helpful. The other important point is that COVID-19 requires more, not even just priming, but ACE2 to be glycosylated. So that's one of the reasons why possibly diabetics are more at risk. Because there's increased risk for glycosylation with a higher blood glucose. In one study, it was found in rats that spironolactone reduced glycosylated ACE2. So I not only have not stopped anyone, I actually talked to patients about this in case they come across that misinformation by good old Dr. Google.
And so therefore, ACE inhibitors too, a little bit of challenge in the beginning. Should they be stopped? Or I think now the current evidence, and I think even from the ACC, is to continue them. All in agreement with that?
Yep.
We also got a question about BTK inhibitors as treatments for the cytokine storm. Any comments?
I'll let Adam take that one.
Oh, how kind of you, sir. Yeah, I honestly don't know. I mean, I think, I think just like in thinking about like how JAK inhibition might be useful, yes, I think there could be potential there. I'm not aware of any studies being pursued. I would argue even the biologics we're most comfortable with could potentially be protective, especially when you think about maybe, IL-12 and 23 blockers or IL-23 blockers or IL-17 blockers, maybe even TNF blockers. I just don't know, but my answer is be curious, and certainly I think it's worth investigating because this is not going anywhere. There's not going to be a sudden switch where all of a sudden like, oh, Corona who? We're going to be dealing with this for quite some time. It's going to be part of our lexicon, and I think we need to have a lot of options of how to manage different presentations and different severities of disease.
I think we'll probably see a lot of these studies that use immunomodulators in combination with Remdesivir. So you basically need an antiviral product. And that's why the study results that were released by Gilead yesterday have generated so much excitement. So it's really the first proof of principle that we can pharmacologically interfere with this virus. It resulted in better outcomes of patients. This is an interim analysis of about 400 some odd patients for a trial that's supposed to be 1,000 patients. They had shorter time to recover and discharge with a trend towards mortality benefit. And so I think the next level of thinking is, well, if someone has cytokine storm, you still want to try and knock out the virus if you can, and then use anti-inflammatories as well.
Last question as we're running up against the hour here. What about vitamin D? Any role for the use of vitamin D? Should patients at risk of COVID-19, or is there any particular role for vitamin D in the setting of COVID-19?
Yeah, I think that if you're vitamin D is a good thing to use if you're washing your hands, social distancing, wearing a mask in public. Outside of that, there's no specific evidence that it's going to be useful.
Yeah, if you look at Bob Malden's work from UCLA, he spent a career looking at the vitamin D receptor and its role in innate immune response to Mycobacterium leprae and tuberculosis. And vitamin D is central to activating antimicrobial peptides, innate immune response. So theoretically, maybe it could help in terms of warding off that initial invasion. But I think beyond that, it would be something very interesting to look at. But we know that vitamin D plays an important role in immune response, but I don't know if anyone's actually looking at this. So it's a great question.
All right, well, listen, I want to thank everyone for not only attending this evening. This concludes our live webinar. I want to thank my panelists, Dr. Friedman, Dr. Council, Dr. Gelfand. Really impactful information, and I appreciate the opportunity for you to participate with us. I want to remind the audience also that if you have potential dermatologic manifestations of COVID-19, to remember that there is a dermatology registry through the Academy at www.aab.org, COVID registry. So please use that for some of your potential cases that present clinically to your practices, particularly as we get back to work in our offices. Obviously, some of us have seen this doing our telemedicine. So thank you all once again. And as a final comment, if you'd like to, you can donate to the New Jersey Pandemic Relief Fund. I know that the MJF Life Sciences would appreciate that. You can see that there's a payment portal there should you choose to do so. And I thank everyone so much for participating, and please stay safe.